The study of history is not always linear. As we journey through world history, we often take detours, zigging and zagging around to different settings during the same time period. You may think, and reasonably so, I learned about absolute monarchs, then the scientific revolution, and now the Enlightenment, so all of these things must have happened in that order. In the grand scheme of things, you'd be right. We are progressing from 1750 to 1950. But when studying history thematically, we explore the nuances of a particular era. And sometimes we need to take a step back, use our wide-angle lens, and really take in just how much is going on in the world at any given time. We think of Louis XIV as being the foremost example of an absolute monarch, so surely he ruled in a time and place where he was adored by all, and no Enlightenment ideals whatsoever existed anywhere, right? No, not at all actually, which makes sense, doesn't it? A desire for social justice, tolerance, and freedom must emerge from a society in which these qualities are lacking. So it shouldn't surprise us that a lot of these people lived at the same time. Voltaire was born into Louis XIV's France, and France continued its absolutist ways under Louis XV. Unlike the study of history, regnal numbers are linear. In this environment, Voltaire and others like him would sometimes get in a bit of hot water when it came to expressing their views about the church or the monarch. Voltaire, in fact, spent a year in the Bastille prison in Paris, which would later become famous for another reason. Well, you'll find out. But Enlightenment ideas began to spread through Europe and even made their way up the chain of command. We'll be considering the following questions. How did the Encyclopedia contribute to the spread of Enlightenment ideas across Europe? How did Enlightenment themes impact artistic expression? And how did some absolute monarchs embrace Enlightenment thinking? And after the video, draw on what you've learned throughout this unit to consider this big picture question in your PDF. How did the Enlightenment shape the cultural, societal, and political landscape of Europe? Let's go back to the 18th century Parisian salons that were the center of the Enlightenment. There, young people came to study and intellectuals shared their philosophies. You may remember that salon holder Marie-Thérèse Joffrin financed the Encyclopedia, perhaps the most famous work of the French Enlightenment. The chief editor and contributor to the Encyclopedia was Denis Diderot. In his writings, Diderot criticized the nobility and royalty while celebrating the efforts of the common working Frenchman. Diderot hoped to use the Encyclopedia to compile essentially everything that was known about the world and make it universally available, thus democratizing knowledge, so to speak, allowing the common person to educate themselves rather than having to rely on church-sponsored schooling reserved only for the privileged. Interestingly enough, modern historians have compared the Encyclopedia to Wikipedia in its use of a wide array of authors and utilization of the latest technology. This was a threat to both the monarchy and the gatekeeper of knowledge, the church. King Louis XV banned the Encyclopedia on the grounds that it undermined the authority of the monarch, encouraged revolt, and fostered moral corruption with anti-religious sentiment. Undeterred, Diderot and others continued to publish their work in mass quantities, thanks to the reduced cost of using new printing technology. Enlightenment ideas were absorbed by a growing literate middle class in Europe. Readers questioned the old system of divine right monarchs and a strict class system and instead were drawn to notions of social justice, peace, and the universal access to happiness. Progress didn't happen overnight. The medieval institution of serfdom, the legal binding of a peasant to a wealthy landlord, was still widespread in Europe. Most people lived in rural villages, and the literacy rate in most European countries was only about 1/4. Tradition still ruled the day, but the needle was moving. Let's pause to answer the following question. How did the Encyclopedia contribute to the spread of Enlightenment ideas across Europe? New styles of architecture, music, and literature emerged, all expressing the Enlightenment themes of order and reason. Pre-Enlightenment musical compositions tended toward the heavy and dramatic. In contrast, the new era of music was lighter and more elegant. Three Austrian composers dominated the classical era: Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. While the 17th and early 18th century was dominated by the ornate Baroque style, indicative of the grandiosity of the lifestyles of Europe's elite, the Enlightenment brought a Greco-Roman-inspired simple elegance. Known as neoclassicism, this style was embodied in architecture, the Bank of England in London and the White House in Washington, D.C., for example, and in painting, notably in Benjamin West's Death of General Wolfe and Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat. Writers began to write longer fictional novels, complete with plots, suspense, and the development of characters' personalities. They were written in everyday language, making them accessible to the middle class. Tales such as Henry Fielding's Tom Jones and Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe brought dramatic and adventurous characters to life for readers. The availability of these works reflected the growing access to literacy and time for leisure activities such as reading, a luxury unknown to most people in the dying feudal society. So, let's review. How did Enlightenment themes impact artistic expression? While absolute monarchies still dominated much of the political landscape of Europe, some rulers began to take an interest in Enlightenment thinking. Ideas spread from salons to studios to concert halls and eventually to royal courts. Many philosophers were close friends with monarchs and persuaded them to enact reforms. You may remember this quote, "I am the first servant of the state." Spoken by Frederick the Great of Prussia, it embodied the ideals of the so-called Enlightened despot. While still acting as supreme ruler, the monarch's responsibility was to ensure the well-being of the people. You may remember Frederick's reforms, increasing freedom of speech, abolishing torture, religious tolerance, and fostering the arts. While Voltaire was persona non grata among the ruling class in his home country, he and other French philosophers were welcomed in Frederick's royal court. Perhaps the most radical of the Enlightened despots was Joseph II of Austria, son of Maria Theresa. As you may recall, his mother pulled the strings on Austria pretty tightly, despite flirting with Enlightenment ideas by improving education and growing the middle class. While Maria maintained a strictly Catholic state, Joseph allowed freedom of worship for all, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews included. Inspired by the Enlightenment idea of the separation of church and state, he believed that a person's religion was of no concern to the government. Joseph, who ruled from 1765 to 1780, abolished the medieval institution of serfdom, something that Frederick failed to do. To shape his changes, he visited remote parts of his kingdom to learn of the problems faced by ordinary people, even plowing fields with them. Ultimately, Joseph's reforms may have been a bit too extreme for the time, as many failed to be fully implemented or were undone after his death. Catherine the Great of Russia, friend of Voltaire and Diderot, ruled from 1762 to 1796. Her intentions were enlightened, but in reality few reforms were realized, aside from a revamping of the legal system and code. Catherine vehemently disagreed with the institution of serfdom and intended to abolish it, but she faced opposition from the nobility. And when her rule ended, serfs actually had less freedom than when she began. Like Peter the Great and his quest for a port on the Baltic Sea, Catherine wanted a port on the Black Sea and won control of its north shore from the Ottoman Empire. She also extended Russian rule to parts of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus. While Catherine may have been a bit more despotic than enlightened, she contributed to the vast enlargement of the Russian Empire and to its status as an emerging world power. Let's cap off the section by asking this question. How did some absolute monarchs embrace Enlightenment thinking? Try to include all three Enlightened despots in your response. So we come to the end of our journey through Enlightened absolutism. But when you think about it, Enlightenment ideals and absolute rule mixed like oil and water. Eventually, something had to give. Remember how we started this lesson? The study of history is not always linear? Yep, at the same time as Voltaire, Frederick, and Joseph, we've got a bunch of colonists across the ocean who have been listening to these Enlightenment ideas and getting pretty annoyed at being kept under a giant monarchical thumb. We hope you have your life vest ready. Yes, you can use your flamingo swimming ring if you prefer, because we're about to sail across the ocean. We're going west to the American colonies where Enlightenment ideals are taking hold, and the people are calling for an end to the establishment. Ready to sail? We're on to new places because history is everywhere.